The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Between the year 1900 and the year 1964, approximately 800 people were hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
She's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
There are elements that make us not sure, and that's our concern.
Searching for new evidence.
I think they were both wrong in actually giving a definitive cause of death.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? On a December afternoon in 1924, a love-struck young woman embarked on a journey from London to rural Sussex. 26-year-old Elsie Cameron was determined to set a date for a wedding to her fiancé, 24-year-old chicken farmer Norman Thorne. But Elsie vanished, and Thorne claimed he knew nothing of her whereabouts. A month after her disappearance, police made a shocking discovery. Thorne admitted he had dismembered Elsie's body, put her head in a tin box, and buried her remains under his chicken run. Despite this gruesome confession, astonishingly, Thorne claimed to be innocent of his fiancée's macabre murder. But after a 5-day trial, he was unanimously found guilty. And on the 22nd of April 1925 at Wandsworth Prison in London, Norman Thorne was hanged. Now, nearly a century later, Gordon Owers and his daughter Helen have only recently learned about this chapter of their family history.
And then this photo here, this is Norman and Elsie.
They don't look that happy together, do they?
Gordon's father was Norman Thorne's first cousin.
We really just want to explore as much evidence as possible, because the more you read about it, the more likely it was that he could have been innocent. And if we can clear his reputation, that's, I think, the least that the family can do to help. The father gave Norman £100 to start the chicken farm, which in the 1920s must have been a sizable sum of money.
I think what we have to remember in this case is no matter what comes out about Norman Thorne, there is, a definite victim here and a definite innocent person in Elsie. So it is a difficult scenario because nothing that can come out of this is going to take away from the fact that Elsie died.
The trial of Norman Thorne was high profile and contentious, dominated by a dispute between two medical experts. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern-day legal investigation bring anything new to bear on a century-old conviction? Jeremy Dean QC was called to the bar in 1982 and is one of the country's leading defence barristers. Sasha Wass QC has successfully prosecuted some of the UK's most notorious criminals. Gordon and Helen have travelled to London to meet the barristers.
Hello.
Hi.
Jeremy.
Good to meet you. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy, I'm Helen.
Nice to meet you both.
Hi.
Hi, Sasha.
Gordon, hello there.
Hi.
I know both of you know a certain amount about the case. What is it that causes you particular concern?
I think the little we know about the trial, a lot depended on forensic evidence.
Yes.
And a lot depended on how highly rated Bernard Spilsbury was.
Yes. I mean, Sir Bernard Spilsbury was a very well-known, almost a celebrity pathologist in his time, and we will look very carefully at that. Leaving to one side the pathological evidence, Is there any other feature of the evidence which you found difficult for Norman Thorne to overcome?
Oh, I mean, certainly the action he took with the body.
Yes.
You know, I mean, if you're a juror
Yes.
and this guy in front of you has cut a body up
Yes.
and put a head in a biscuit tin.
He lost a lot of credibility by his actions,
Yes.
and I think that understandably led people to form an opinion that if he was capable of that, you'd then question what else he was capable of. You know, our concern is that if there is any element of doubt, that's too much. You have to be sure, and I think there are elements that make us not sure, and that's our concern.
Jeremy and I will go away, we will look at everything available to us, and then we will come back and have some news for you.
Norman Thorne was born in Portsmouth in 1900 and moved with his father and stepmother to London in 1911. At his local Methodist church in Kensal Rise, he met and fell in love with fellow parishioner Elsie Cameron. Thorne then bought a plot of land in rural Sussex and started his own poultry farm. By Christmas 1922, he and Elsie were engaged. They wrote regularly to each other, and Elsie made frequent trips from North London to see him. However, signs of strain started to show in the long-distance relationship, and it was clear Norman was going cold on the idea of wedlock. But was he capable of murder?
Well, Jeremy, on the 5th of December 1924, Elsie Cameron left London to go to Crowborough in East Sussex to see her fiancé, Norman Thorne. On the 10th of December, Elsie's father reported her missing. Norman Thorne was questioned by the police and initially denied that Elsie had ever been to the farm on the 5th of December or that he knew where she was. But on the 10th of January, after a neighbour called Annie Price, one of Mr. Thorne's neighbours, returned from a short holiday, she saw reports in a newspaper about Elsie's disappearance. And she went to the police and said that she had seen Elsie Cameron go to Norman Thorne's farm on the 5th of December. Following that, police searched the farm and they found several of Elsie's possessions. And then Norman Thorne changed his account. He admitted dismembering and burying her body. His account to the police was that he didn't kill her, rather she had killed herself. He explained what he did by saying that he was worried that he might be blamed for her death.
Well, Sasha, there are two main areas of the case that we need to focus on. The first is the pathology and the question of whether any reliable conclusions could ever have been reached, bearing in mind that Elsie Cameron's body was dismembered, not exhumed, for a significant period of time. The second main area we need to focus upon is state of mind. As regards Elsie Cameron, we need to look at her psychiatric records. We also need to look at Norman Thorne's state of mind, because on the face of it, for him to have dismembered Elsie Cameron and pretended that he knew nothing about her death is suspicious. But I'm by no means convinced that it is necessarily as sinister as it might first look.
Gordon and Helen want to understand how events unfolded the night of Elsie's death. They've come to the crime scene to meet author Diane Janes, who has researched the case extensively.
This, on this side here, is where Norman's farm was.
The site is now an area of woodland.
The point that we're standing at now, as near as we can guess it, is where the gate to the farm was.
Right.
On the 5th of December 1924, Elsie Cameron was seen entering Norman's farm at around 5 p.m.
So we know that Elsie arrived here and she went through this gate. And of course it would have been dark because it was December, but if it had been light, this is what she would have seen. As you can see, mud, where they had this terrible weather. And then a bit further up, this was actually where he was living, this hut, which is really barely bigger than the garden shed.
It's so primitive.
Elsie arrived And she and Norman had quite a row because Norman said, "What are you doing down here?" Elsie said, "Well, I'm going to stay and we've got to get married." She also kept telling Norman that she was pregnant.
Right.
Elsie's doctor had said she might be in the early stages of pregnancy. As a result, it appeared that she was determined that her and Norman should be wed as soon as possible.
Norman said, "I can't possibly marry you at the moment." According to Norman, he leaves at 9:45-ish. Now, of course, the prosecution view is that, in fact, they'd had a huge argument and Norman had attacked and killed Elsie.
By then.
By then.
Diane has been studying Norman Thorne's version of what happened later that night.
Norman says that he eventually arrived back here at 11:30 at night. He said he walked up, opened the door of the hut and found that Elsie was hanging, that she had hanged herself from the beam that held the hut up. Norman said he was completely shocked, absolutely horrified by this, that he immediately cut her down, laid her on the bed. He said he wasn't afraid that people would think that he'd murdered Elsie, but that people would consider he was responsible for Elsie's death.
Yeah.
So Norman goes down to his workshop, he gets a hacksaw and some sacking, and he saws Elsie's body up. Now, the prosecution, of course, said, "Well, this is nonsense. Norman, why would he have done that? He cut her up because he was trying to cover up the fact that he'd murdered her."
At this point, Thorne disposed of Elsie by burying her body parts under his chicken run.
He knew that even if people didn't think he'd murdered her, they would always blame him, you know, for her death, because she killed herself because of perhaps love for him. And he would always have that guilt, but not necessarily the guilt of murder.
As inquiries into Elsie's disappearance gathered pace, police took statements from local residents of Crowborough, including a young woman named Elizabeth Caldecott, also known as Bessie. In a startling development, Bessie revealed that she and Thorne were in a romantic relationship, having met at a dance earlier that year. By the time of her death, Elsie was aware of this tryst, and it was claimed she was in a state of psychological distress.
Jeremy, the prosecution put forward the clearest motive in this case. Norman Thorne was no longer in love with Elsie Cameron, and his only way out of this relationship was to get rid of her. She'd become an albatross around his neck.
Sasha, the motive you identify would be all well and good if there were not indications that Elsie Cameron might have been disposed to suicide. She had some form of psychiatric illness. I don't believe the prosecution could properly prove that she was murdered.
Well, can I help you with that? Firstly, she was dead. Secondly, as soon as she had died, he cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found. It is always relevant in any case to see how a person approaches the body, the dead body of somebody who they were in a relationship with. Had he been shocked, as he claimed to have been at trial, the last thing he would have done was got out a hacksaw, cut off her head and put it in a biscuit tin.
If he found her dead, it is a possibility that he panicked too extreme and that he acted in the way that he did as a consequence.
What we must also bear in mind, Jeremy, is that following the 5th of December, following the disposal of her body, Norman Thorne acted in a very calculating way. He wrote letters to Elsie. He knew she was dead. He claimed to help the police to try to find her. He pretended to be concerned. He did everything possible in a very calculating way to make sure that he wasn't caught. So that isn't the behaviour of somebody in the throes of grief or shock. That is somebody who has behaved as a cold-blooded killer.
I suggest that the mind can play tricks and that it is within the realms of possibility that the way he behaved was triggered by the shock he suffered when he came home and found the woman he loved hanging from that rafter.
Gordon and Helen want to learn more about the brewing tensions that were generated in chicken farmer Norman Thorne's complicated love triangle. with Elizabeth Caldecott and Elsie Cameron. They're meeting again with case expert Diane Janes.
We've actually got Elizabeth's statement here, and she says, I first went to his hut and had tea in about September. So we can see the relationship now is getting a bit more friendly. They're actually being together unchaperoned. In November, I went fairly regularly, several times in the week. She's getting there at about 8:30 in the evening, staying till 10:30. So she's spending the evening with him, and she admits that they kissed and cuddled in the armchair. Elizabeth says that he was always absolutely candid, that he was engaged to Elsie, so she knew that. But she also knew that he was trying to break it off with Elsie. I think by degrees. He suggests that perhaps Elsie will realise that his letters are cooling a bit.
And very much hoping that Elsie would call it off, was what he was trying to drive her behaviour towards.
Or at least recognise that it was over, and,
Yes.
and she won't.
She won't, and I think that this is the problem, that Elsie is just utterly determined that Norman's going to marry her. Norman certainly suggests that her parents had been pressurising her to get married, and choices for unmarried girls then were very limited.
So even being married to an unsuccessful chicken farmer was preferable to being on your own?
Yes, she may well have seen it like that.
Elsie Cameron was born in London in 1898. From the age of 14, she worked as a typist, but in 1924 was signed off by her employer following a nervous collapse. The state of her mental health was discussed at trial, and whether she had ever demonstrated any suicidal behaviour.
Joseph, hello.
For a modern-day assessment, the barristers are meeting with consultant forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Joseph.
I want to begin by focusing upon Elsie Cameron. There was a witness who gave evidence at trial, Miss Mildred Pearson, who worked in the same office as Elsie Cameron. She said that on one occasion, on the way home, she behaved very strangely. They went by the Metropolitan Railway from Aldgate. When they got on the platform, she walked right to the edge of the platform. She was held back.
Do you understand from that this is a contemplation of suicide?
Not necessarily. I don't think there's enough information, but it's certainly an episode of psychiatric disturbance. But there's no evidence that she ever did do anything to harm herself. And even that is a far cry from actually killing yourself.
We know from the letters that have passed between them that by the end of 1924, Norman Thorne had taken up with another young lady. He had told Elsie about this. How seriously would you take threats of harm in those circumstances?
She wasn't making threats to harm herself at that time. Indeed, what she seemed to be saying to Norman was, I'm pregnant, whether she was or not. And I think one would also have to bear in mind that if she did indeed think that she was pregnant, it would be quite a step for her to kill herself and the unborn baby. Indeed, one could look at his letter of the 3rd of December, where he's suggesting that she comes down to see him. One can't rule out the possibility that he was, in fact, luring her down in order to kill her.
Norman Thorne's case being that he found her dead, believed that she'd committed suicide, panicked, and in order to avoid suspicion being cast on him, dismembered her. To what extent could shock at having discovered her body in the aftermath of tension between them have led him to behave in that way?
I think it's extremely unlikely. There would be no panic that could explain a decision then to dismember the body, bury it in a field, and carry on with life. Certainly, it all points to a premeditated killing, that he got her down there on false pretenses, killed her and disposed of the body, having decided he was going to pretend that she'd never arrived. So there's a sort of callous, psychopathic flavour to his behaviour.
When Elsie Cameron was not making the frequent rail journeys to see Norman Thorne, the pair wrote prolifically to one another. Gordon and Helen have discovered this very correspondence and want to examine it for clues into their relationship in the build-up to that fateful night. They've come to the Bluebell Railway, close to the route Elsie took from London to Thorne's poultry farm.
These letters start in November There's one from Norman where he says, there are one or two things I haven't told you. It concerns someone else as well who you don't know. I'm afraid I am between two fires. And this presumably is the first message to her that it's over.
And she says here, in response to that letter, I guess, what do you mean by you are afraid, you are between two fires? Oh, I don't understand things at all.
And this letter says, what I haven't told you is that on certain occasions a girl has been here late at night. She thinks I'm going to marry her, of course, and I have a strong feeling for her, or I shouldn't have done what I have.
Obviously, it was clear to her at this point that she needed to, you know, take action immediately and that she was going to lose Norman.
And therefore it must have been a very lonely and unhappy and a desperate journey by Elsie.
Norman Thorne's trial began in Lewes on the 11th of March 1925. The proceedings were dominated by a disagreement between two eminent pathologists, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, called by the prosecution, and Dr. Robert Bronte for the defence. The medical experts could not agree on Elsie Cameron's cause of death. Sasha and Jeremy are meeting Professor of Forensic Medical Sciences, Peter Venezis, who studied both pathologists' evidence.
What Mr. Thorne told the jury was this: I returned to the hut and I saw to my horror Elsie suspended to a beam in the centre of the hut. So that would be here. I rushed in, I took a knife, I cut the cord, and the weight of the body fell against him. In this case, there were two post-mortems, weren't there?
Yeah.
The first one was conducted by a pathologist who gave evidence for the prosecution, Sir Bernard Spilsbury.
Yes.
And he did not see any evidence of rope marks at all, but described some bruising around the face. Is it possible to say whether they were necessarily post-mortem bruises caused when he was pulling the body down, or could they have been before death during a struggle when he was trying to kill her?
Having been in the ground for a period of time, and also the blood having also deteriorated within the tissue, it actually makes it almost impossible to tell the difference between the two.
Peter, could you just spell out for us what, respectively, Bernard Spilsbury and Dr. Bronte concluded by way of cause of death in this case?
Certainly. Well, Spilsbury did not believe that she had hanged. He believed that the cause of death was as a result of all the bruises. When you put them all together, there was blood loss from all these bruises, that she'd gone into shock and died in that way. On the other hand, Bronte tells us that he saw a crease in the neck at the second autopsy, and he thought that the cause of death could well be hanging.
Do you believe that either or both of the experts who gave evidence at Thorne's trial were in a position to identify cause of death?
No, I don't think they were. The head had been decapitated, body had been in the ground for so long. Bronte was in an even more difficult position because he did the examination later on. I think they were both wrong in actually giving a definitive cause of death, and I think the cause of death in this case should be unascertained.
Peter, thank you very much. This has been immensely useful, and it's given Jeremy and me a lot to think about, so very nice to see you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
After a 5-day trial, the jury returned their verdict following just half an hour's deliberation. They found Norman Thorne guilty of murder, and the judge, Mr. Justice Finlay, passed the death sentence. The case aroused widespread controversy, particularly over the perceived influence on the jury of the famous pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury. Gordon and Helen are examining some of the press coverage from the time.
This is a devastating article in the Law Journal, which was obviously a highly respected and influential journal. I mean, it says here that he may or may not have been guilty, but the speed with which the jury came to a decision and the fact that they seemed to rely totally on Sir Bernard Spilsbury having a sort of papal infallibility about him suggests that they listened to him and didn't look at any other of the evidence. Thorne is entitled to feel that he has been condemned by a tribunal which was not capable of forming a first-hand judgment, but followed the man with the biggest name. And that's a devastating statement by such an eminent journal.
And then this one here is from the Leeds Mercury.
Am I a martyr to Spilsburyism?
And that's actually from Norman himself.
And I mean, from what we've read earlier, seen earlier, he's absolutely right. And then there's this article by Arthur Conan Doyle saying, I'm not quite easy about this case. In 99 cases in 100, there are absolutely strong reasons for a conviction for murder. Personally, I'm against capital punishment unless the murder has been definitely established. It's one thing to hang a man, but it's an impossible thing to resuscitate him. In any case where there is the faintest doubt, I do not think that the sentence should be carried out. In the Thorne case, there does seem to me to be that faint doubt existing.
Yeah.
And that's it. I mean, he doesn't have to have been innocent, but he can't be found guilty, especially when you're talking about the jury being out for 30 minutes.
When Norman Thorne was sentenced to death, he was transferred to Wandsworth Prison to await his execution. Gordon and Helen are meeting curator of Wandsworth Prison Museum, Stuart McLaughlin. He's taking them to the former condemned cell where Thorne was held, which is now an office and staff kitchen.
Could you take me through what would have happened the morning of his execution?
The prisoner was sitting with the chaplain of their faith up until the point of the time of execution. So everything was kept to keep the prisoner calm. The whole process was done as quickly as possible to catch a prisoner by surprise. He'd be pinioned in the condemned cell here with his arms and then walked across the corridor. Then the ankles would be strapped and then it would simply be cap, noose, knock out the safety pins from the lever, push the lever and he'd drop. And it would all take place pretty much in the time span in which I've described it. It was that quick.
That's really quite horrifying. Thank you.
I have a copy of the Register of Executions. What we have here is the entry for John Norman Holmes Thorne.
Just 24 years old.
Thank you. Thank you.
With Judgment Day looming, Jeremy has been delving deeper into the dispute between pathologists at Norman Thorne's trial and how the judge dealt with this area of the evidence. He's found something new which could cast Norman Thorne's murder conviction in an entirely different light.
The judge said this: you've got the evidence of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, of his eminence in his profession. It's not necessary that I should say one word. That was admitted in the frankest way by the doctors who were called by the defence, in particular by Dr. Bronte. Sir Bernard Spilsbury would be the first to disclaim infallibility in matters of this sort. But his opinion is undoubtedly the very best opinion that can be obtained. And you will, of course, consider what he says with the very utmost care. Sasha, in my firm view, this was a wholly and proper speech, a glowing, irresistible character reference for Bernard Spilsbury. So, in my view, the impact of it was to remove from the jury any possible scope for accepting the defence pathological evidence, thus making it inevitable that Norman Thorne would be found guilty of murder.
Well, Jeremy, the eminence that is referred to is not eminence that the judge is talking about. It is eminence, as he said, that was admitted in the frankest way by the doctors who were called by the defence, in particular by Dr. Bronte. The judge is not saying that he is giving Sir Bernard Spilsbury a reference, but that the defence experts had.
But then the judge takes it upon himself to say, But his opinion is undoubtedly the very best opinion that can be obtained. And you will, of course, consider what he says with the very utmost care. So I suggest that the judge directed the jury that Bernard Spilsbury was the best thing since sliced bread. And reading the judge's summing up, you'd have thought that this was a talent competition for pathologists, not a murder trial for Norman Thorne. And I would suggest that this is a matter which goes right to the heart of the safety of Norman Thorne's conviction. Bernard Spilsbury appears to have gained untouchable status in the criminal cause, and it seems that it was fashionable to worship Bernard Spilsbury when you were a judge, and that it will be regarded as breaking ranks not to do so. That's my impression.
Norman Thorne was executed at Wandsworth Prison on the 22nd of April 1925. Stuart is taking Gordon and Helen to the site of his final resting place. As was required by the law at the time, he was buried within the prison grounds, and today the site is unmarked.
Now, Norman was actually placed in grave number 48, which actually follows the complete line of K-wing from that gully to A-wing from that gully. So Norman's grave is pretty much where I'm standing, and that's where he remains buried to this day.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed.
This is it.
It's sad that there is no marking for him.
And probably more so for his family, had nowhere to go at that time, and, you know, his father and his stepmother and couldn't go and visit a grave and couldn't go and pay their respects.
And that's what every parent wants to do if they have lost a child, yes.
Sasha and Jeremy must now present their arguments to Senior Crown Court Judge David Radford.
I think one of the greatest problems Mr. Thorne had in this case was not so much the cause of death, but what he actually did to the body after death. And that's something I think Jeremy is going to have to address before Judge Radford.
There are serious issues with the pathological evidence given at trial, and also the way the pathology was dealt with in summing up. So I've got some strong arguments to say that Norman Thorne's conviction for murder is unsafe.
For Gordon and Helen, today could be an opportunity to clear their relative's name, 94 years after he was hanged for murder.
What we really feel is that Norman did have an unfair trial, and really we just want to see a verdict which recognises that.
Gordon, hello.
Hello.
So, how are you feeling?
I think nervous about the decision.
Yes.
But hopeful.
Good. I think we've got to go in now, so if you follow me, all
Okay,
right?
thank you.
Sasha and Jeremy must now present their arguments to Judge David Radford.
Please take a seat. We are here today for me to consider, with the assistance of learned counsel, the safety of the conviction for murder of Norman Thorne. Mr. Dean, would you like to start?
Your Honour, may I say that I accept that this is a case in which the dismemberment of Miss Cameron's body is a particularly unpleasant feature, and no doubt this highly distressing aspect of the case caused Mr. Thorne very considerable difficulties at trial. However, it is my submission that this feature of the case should not distract from the question of whether Norman Thorne's conviction for murder is properly to be regarded as unsafe. It's my submission that there was no evidence to contradict Mr. Thorne's assertion that Elsie Cameron had or might have hanged herself. Professor Peter Venezis referred to the competing perspectives of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, prosecution pathologist on the one hand, who at trial rejected suicide but stated that the cause of death was shock due to bruising. And on the other hand, the opinion of Dr. Bronte, called by the defence, who had said
that he saw creases in the neck at autopsy and thought that Miss Cameron had died from hanging.
Professor Peter Venesis.
Drawing from far greater developed fields of pathology, said that the cause of death in this case should have been unascertained, that neither pathologist was in a position to express an opinion. The position in this case, in my submission, is that the judge promoted Sir Bernard Spilsbury to the jury to a degree which made it simply impossible for any alternative scenario to be contemplated by the jury. This is what the judge said in the course of the summing up as regards the evidence of Bernard Spilsbury. You have got the evidence of Sir Bernard Spilsbury, of his eminence in his profession. His opinion is undoubtedly the very best opinion that can be obtained. And I respectfully pose the question, how could a jury possibly be expected to reject the evidence of the prosecution pathologist in those circumstances? It's my submission that the irregularities in this case were such that whatever Miss Wass has to say about the state of the evidence, the trial became unwieldy and unfair, and it led Norman Thorne inevitably to be convicted of murder when, in circumstances of a fair trial, he might not have been. And for these reasons, it's my submission that his conviction is unsafe.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Dean, for your clear submissions.
Thank you.
Miss Wass.
Your Honour, at the time of Elsie Cameron's death, Norman Thorne had lost all interest in her. He had turned his attention to another woman, Elizabeth Caldecott. Elsie had told Norman Thorne that she was pregnant, and she told him that he was obliged to marry her. In this case, Mr. Dean and I have had the assistance of Dr. Philip Joseph, a forensic psychiatrist of some considerable experience, in order to ascertain whether there existed any evidence of Elsie Cameron's suicidal tendencies. And the clear answer from Dr. Joseph was no. In addition, Dr. Joseph made the observation that Elsie Cameron, believing that she was pregnant and believing that Mr. Thorne was going to marry her because she was pregnant, actually had everything to live for and no reason whatsoever to kill herself, let alone her unborn baby. Now, the question that Your Honour will obviously want to consider is, had the jury been told what Dr. Veneses' opinion was, namely that the cause of death was unascertained, what evidence remained of Norman Thorne's guilt? Which brings me to what I suggest is the most powerful evidence in this case against Norman Thorne: the decapitation and dismemberment of Elsie Cameron. Mr. Dean has accepted that this was unattractive, rather as if it was some sort of lapse in good manners. But Dr. Joseph took the matter considerably more serious than that, suggesting that had Mr. Thorne genuinely found that his fiancée had killed herself, it would be extremely unlikely that he would then go on to desecrate her body in a moment of panic. And Dr. Joseph described Norman Thorne's actions amounting to callous, psychopathic behaviour. So by his very own admission, the jury had evidence before them that Norman Thorne was a manipulative liar, whose overall intention was that Elsie's dismembered body would not be discovered and she would rot in an unconsecrated grave. And in the submissions of the prosecution at trial, which I echo, these are not the actions of a heartbroken fiancé. These are the reactions of a man who saw Elsie Cameron as a burden, who had feelings of anger and hostility to her,
and caused him to murder her. So there is nothing from a modern-day perspective which suggests that this is an unsafe verdict.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Wass. Well, I shall further review this case. Would you be good enough to give me some time to do that, please?
Okay. Well, hearing's now over. What's your feeling about what was said?
I don't think, if I'm honest, it changes my view that the judge influenced the jury on behalf of Sir Bernard Spilsbury.
Yeah.
They were only out for half an hour,
Yeah.
which seems appalling to me, that somebody could be sentenced to death as a result of less than half an hour's deliberation.
The judge should be making a decision soon.
Did Norman Thorne murder his fiancée nearly 100 years ago? Or was it a miscarriage of justice? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
I consider, looking at all of the evidence, that on the face of it, there's no sound reason, in my view, for believing that Miss Cameron, believing she was pregnant, would take her own life. The defendant, of course, had repeatedly lied to the police. The only sensible inference the jury must have thought, even if the death was to be regarded as unascertained, and each of the pathologist's opinion was not decisive, is that the defendant killed and dismembered this young woman who had become a hindrance to his preferred future life with another. I'm in no doubt at all, taking account of the modern inquiries, that the jury were fully entitled to reach the verdict that they did. This was a safe conviction. I shall rise.
There's no doubt that an innocent girl died, but I don't know whether Norman killed her or not.
Yeah.
But I do think there wasn't enough evidence at the trial to find him guilty.
And how do you feel about the judge's reasoning?
I think there's no shadow of a doubt that Norman's actions, you know, did him no favours whatsoever and aren't acceptable.
Absolutely,
you know, he didn't behave, you know, whether it was through desperation, you know, that he was innocent and behaved inappropriately. Ultimately, if that was the case, it resulted in, you know, him losing his life.
The death penalty to me is appalling, but if somebody is going to face a death penalty, you almost hope he was guilty in the context of the time. And for an innocent man to be hanged would be utterly appalling.